Hey there, my name's Jeff Reed at Reply Farm, and I had the coolest experience recently with a chickadee, a nuthatch, and a goshawk. It kind of sounds like a joke, but some biologist friends asked me to post the video I captured of the experience, and so I just put together these slides for some context and wanted to post it. So be gracious to me. This is a dry run, but I wanted to get it up on YouTube and share it for my friends and then for others to give commentary on. Ultimately, this is really about animal communication. And so I wanted to share a quote from Plato, and this is a translation I did of the Statesman. And it kind of sets the context for this experience I had. So here's Plato. You claim there are two kinds of living things, the human race and a second one, the beasts. But wait, I don't buy that argument. What if animals are as capable of thought such as the crane appears to be? And what if the crane decided to give names to things just as you do? Perhaps they would do the same thing people do and favor cranes over all other creatures and group all other animals, humans included, under one name: beasts. So many moons ago, 35 years, I moved from here in southwest Montana near the north entrance to Yellowstone Park to here, Los Angeles, to essentially study anthropology and in particular linguistics. And in particular, I focused in on Hellenistic Greek. This is the Greek word for hello or greetings. You may not know the letters and you may struggle pronouncing this. The way you would pronounce this in Greek, to the best of our knowledge, is kairete. The P is actually pronounced as an R. The X is a K sound. But like most people who don't know Hellenistic Greek, these symbols are gibberish to you. This is a Greek text from the 4th century BC. It's one of the oldest papyrus we have. And the letters there you're seeing kind of in the center of the screen are Greek letters, and they'll be gibberish to you, most of you as well. You might recognize some of the letters, but you don't know how to pronounce the words. And since Greek didn't use punctuation like English does, they all run together, so you don't even know where the words are. But that symbol over there on the left is called a coronis. It's where we get our word for crow, or crooked beak was the Greek meaning. And it was often used in narratives or plays to signify kind of a transition from one section or one act to the other. And what's pretty cool about this text is, even though you might not know Greek, you can recognize what that symbol is right there. This is a baked clay tablet from about 5,000 years ago found in Jiroft in Iran. And it bears, these geometric shapes, and researchers have not been able to decipher this script. We don't know what this text means, even though it comes from the same region where cuneiform originated, and which we have deciphered. But these symbols, none of us know what they mean. It's gibberish to us, even though we can see patterns in them. Symbols we've probably written ourselves before, like a circle. But nobody knows what they mean. This is a spectrogram. These are 3 chickadees making different calls roughly at about the same time that are recorded, that I'll tell you about in a little bit. These words, so to speak, may also be gibberish to you and gibberish to most people. Like, we wouldn't understand what they necessarily mean. A spectrogram is humans' attempt to take auditory sounds and translate it into a visual scheme, just like we do with writing. We take spoken words and we create a scheme to display that visually to others. This is a picture from a German late medieval depiction of the construction of the Tower of Babel. And as you saw from those previous slides, humans always want to find meaning in symbols. And this notion of having one human language was really the story of Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, where humans at one time had, so goes the narrative, had one language and were so powerful with that one language because everybody could communicate with one another that they built this tower to the heavens. And God essentially created all the languages in the world, which made it hard for people to coordinate and organize and prevented them from, ever building a tower to heaven again. So you see this power of having language across all species. In fact, some of you recognize this is the flag of Esperanto, the attempt to create a language that everybody can understand. So there's this basic need or desire to understand how we communicate with one another and the meanings of one another. But the reality is there are many, many languages across the globe. And over time, those languages change rapidly. And once we think we know someone's dialect, it changes further, and then we don't understand it. This is a depiction of California in roughly about 1,000 years ago, right before European contact, and the number of languages on the California coast of First Peoples. And if you think about this story, let's say it's 15,000 years ago, roughly, that the first humans come into North America and settle. And from what we know, at least today, there might have been 2 waves or a single wave of people, but there weren't a lot of languages at the time. We don't know how many, but presumably it was just 1 or 2 that came in. And over time, as people separated and created groups and spread out and subdivided, you have all of these different languages that arise, languages that nobody knew how to talk with one another across a valley floor in California. So it gives you a sense of how, even if you had one language at one time, it can divide and morph to the point that you might have a heritage with one another, but you can't speak to one another anymore. It's true of animals as well. This is a depiction by the famous researcher Kon Slobodovich and his discovery that prairie dogs use various sounds to depict different animals and different objects. These are the words for green and yellow that prairie dogs use across 5 different species. So there's the Gunnison's, Utah, whitetail, blacktail, Mexican. And you can see the word for green and yellow across those 5 species. Each word, is pronounced differently. But even across species, they don't use the same words. So there are these dialects, and sometimes you can even just call them languages because they don't mean the same thing. And that's true of animals as well. So linguists will often talk about this notion, this kind of Platonic form of language. Is there this embedded language genetically and biologically in people? But they'll also talk about the reality that if there is even such a thing as language form, it gets realized in multiple different ways when you actually use it in cultures and society. Sometimes, however, words are so important to survival that the actual sound spans cultures and time and becomes somewhat, and I use that deliberately, somewhat universal. So for example, the word locks. This English word hasn't changed sound or meaning in 8,000 years and is shared by many other Indo-European languages, and in fact was one of the key words that allowed scholars to figure out Indo-European language history. The family tree of Indo-European languages sprawls Eurasia, includes things like English and a language called Takaran B, an extinct language that was in a territory of modern China. The word in Takaran B for fish or salmon is lachs with a K, more of a K sound, similar to German lachs and Icelandic lachs. The only ancestor all these languages share is the Proto-Indo-European. In Russian, Czech, Croatian, Macedonian, Latvian, the K sound was changed to an S, resulting in the word losos. And in his book, The Power of Babel, is a great book by just really bright linguist John McWhorter. He wrote, everything about language is eternally and inherently changeable, not just the slang and the occasional cultural destination, but the very sound and meaning of basic words and the word order and grammar are very fungible. But he even admits that sometimes some words don't change across different cultures and different languages, like the word locks. And in the bird world, there are similar words that seem to transcend species and possibly time. One of those words is likely what we refer to as an alarm call. So this is the experience I had. That's a photo I took from a goshawk in a cottonwood tree behind the house. And this is the word in Chickadee for danger. Or we don't totally know what it means, but in this particular case, it was referring to this goshawk. So we're going to come back to it and look at it. Now, this particular word, if we call it that, has been studied by various people, including a great publication by Eric Green and others. And this is the spectrogram symbol here in red, circled in red in the middle of the screen, that multiple different species of bird use as an alarm threat for a hawk. And you can see they're very similar in shape, and therefore they're similar in sound, actual sound. But what's weird about this particular sound is it's also a very similar sound used by a particular caterpillar. And you can see the spectrogram here of this caterpillar making this same sound. And it's the same kilohertz frequency and almost the same. It sounds identical to human ears. But what's really unique, if you play back this caterpillar sound, which is what they make when they're being attacked by something dangerous like a bird eating them, they'll make this squeal sound by expelling air out of pores in their body. And if you play back this sound to a chickadee or another bird, they will act in a way that indicates that they think there's a threat nearby. And so the question is it a universal sort of word that birds might know about and other species might know about? We don't know, but that's the whole premise of this video I'm going to show you. So the reason birds use this word is pretty obvious. It's dangerous out there. This is outside my back door. This is Cooper's hawk that had just killed a red-winged blackbird. You can see the little sliver of red there off the primary feather of the Cooper's hawk. And so it's a dangerous world. Of course, you're going to probably have alarm calls to indicate to one another that something bad's out there. This is a northern shrike. In the same bush that I'm going to show you the chickadees were in, this northern shrike had come into this bush to attack the chickadees. And it's another threat to them. It's a much smaller threat, but it's a threat that can get places that a bigger bird can't. And, these are what shrikes do to birds. They kill them. So, of course, this is another threat. A great horned owl, a common threat to many passerine birds. And there's all sorts of mobbing behavior different bird species will use to make one another aware that a great horned owl or other owls are in the area. But this is the velociraptor of bird killers, a northern goshawk that is kind of rarely down on the Yellowstone River where we live, but I was lucky enough to film footage of outside my back window. And this goshawk in particular was after this particular bird, a Eurasian collared dove that was below the goshawk. So the goshawk's looking down, and this dove is in the cottonwood tree below it, kind of bunched right up against the trunk, and this goshawk's waiting for lunch or dinner. So I'm going to play the video, and I'm going to give you context for where it took place. So this is a view above our farm, looking out on the Yellowstone River, and kind of what took place. So the red line here is the distance the hawk traveled from back and forth in these different cottonwood trees over about a 1 hour period. The dove was right here at this red push pin. Next to the dove in another tree was a mountain chickadee. And then here in blue, the black-capped chickadees are in a bush. And then you'll see some videos of the hawk in a tree here in yellow. And down here over in the bottom right, there was another event that took place a little while later that I call a mobbing event, where a bunch of these birds got together to make different vocalizations because they were threatened by something else. So that's the context of where this video took place. And to kind of give you a better view, here's a view out my back door by my den. And you can see a bird feeder here, and you see to the left of that bird feeder is a sumac bush. And this is where the chickadees were hanging out when I was filming them. And this cottonwood behind them, and then there's about 40 cottonwoods along the river bank that this goshawk was flying in between. But sometimes you'll see the video of the goshawk in this cottonwood. So that gives you context for the video. I'm only going to play 3 minutes of a bunch of clips from what took about an hour. So here's the actual recording. So these are the 3 primary black-capped chickadees in the sumac bush, and they were there for at least an hour. There's the goshawk. In this particular case, he was off up to the right, but he was not really focused at all on the chickadees. He was focused on the dove. So you can see this particular bird looking right at the direction of the goshawk. So that's the classic chickadee call, chickadee-dee-dee. See if you can pick out which birds are making which calls and what types of calls. There's the dove, the poor dove. So at times, the goshawk was right above that dove. Notice that slightly different chickadee call. We'll come back to that. Sounds a little different than the others.
Fine bird.
And this is essentially at the end. I missed the actual moment of truth when the dove flew off and the goshawk attacked it. I was I had to go inside because I was filming in bare feet. And my wife saw the goshawk kill the dove. I let my English setter out as a bird dog, see if we could find the dove. And we didn't find the dove, but we did find a feather, unfortunately, for the goshawk. I kind of want to turn my attention to the behavior. So this is a spectrogram of a particular segment of time, and this is the bird I call Sven. Sven's the dominant male in this group. I see these chickadees a lot. And there's good research that shows in chickadee species, dominants show much less risky behavior in calls and movement than non-dominants, which makes sense, right? Older and wiser, right? You're not going to do stupid things. And Sven would take this freeze position while the two other chickadees with him would be squawking away and look right at the goshawk. And this particular series of 4 calls circled here in white is the unique, it's the only call Sven made this entire time that this goshawk was here. The other calls there, this is a signature of the chickadee, chickadee dee dee, and this is chickadee dee 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 dee, multiple D notes there. But Sven would do just this A note call essentially, and would often take this freeze position and look right at the goshawk. Another thing that I observed with Sven when I finally sat down and really watched the video and the spectrogram at the same time was, and it took me a while, I didn't see this till like 2 months after I'd recorded it, but you see on my screen here, you see this kind of upside down fish hook. That is, at 8 kilohertz, and I believe it's also an alarm call, but it's a slight variant from the standard alarm call. And I want you to, I'm going to play back from my computer the video of Sven and the spectrogram at the same time, and watch this white line that will move across the screen, and where it moves across the screen corresponds to the video. And when you see that white line cross that upside down fishhook sign, and you'll hear the call, watch what Sven does. So first off, that's the sound of that upside down fishhook I just played. So this is in a loop, so you're going to see this 4 or 5 times, but right now, watch what Sven does. So it's going to replay again, and right now, watch what Sven does. You get one more chance at it. Notice that? It took me a while to actually observe it, but that particular alarm call is by a bird off to the left of Sven, just right off of frame. And you notice there when that call came out, Sven ducks his head and looks up. And there's a little bit of skipping in the video playback just because of the frame rate. But if you see this live on my computer screen, it's obvious that he's doing this ducking movement and looking up. So he's responding to the other bird's call as well. Now, down here on the bottom is about a 30-second spectrogram of various calls. So the birds are going back and forth. These 3 birds are making 3 different, calls and repeating them. That's the whole discourse, basically. And then in the gray area here, if you blow that up to here, here are the spectrogram of the 3 different calls. And these 3 different calls are made by 3 different birds, even though, every chickadee makes these 3 calls. But in this sequence, this first alarm call, a high Z call, is made by this bird number 1. Number 2, which is Sven, makes this A note call. And number 3, kind of hidden there in the back of the bush, is the bird that always is making the chickadee call. And these birds never diverted from this behavior in the entire, time I heard them calling, which probably occupied 20 minutes. What's really interesting about this is that first call, that alarm call, if you play back that call to a nuthatch, which is a bird that hangs around chickadees quite a bit, not in social groups as much as chickadees, but usually in pairs. If you play that back, that nuthatch will act in a certain way. So here is that alarm call, this first symbol you're seeing that bird number 1 made. Here's the recording. Okay, there's 2 pieces to this one. Not all researchers point out 2 calls, but this bird was making a double sequence call. Played again. So that's highly amplified, but that's what that sounds like. Now, what I did is I took this sequence of calls, and the next day I put a speaker out by my bird feeder that you saw, and this nuthatch comes to the bird feeder regularly to find seeds, and I decided to play back that alarm call to a nuthatch. So I'm going to play you a recording of what the nuthatch does when I play back the chickadee alarm call. So I've got a video camera pointed here at the bird feeder. I know that the nuthatch is going to come back to the bird feeder to feed, and then I play the chickadee recording and watch what the nuthatch does. So it's playing 3 times. That first little squeak is the chickadee alarm call, and then you hear the other sequence happen. And the nuthatch freezes instantly before any of the other calls, and immediately upon hearing the chickadee alarm call. Eventually there's some other contact calls. I couldn't tell if that was a nuthatch or something else. And he's like, okay, it's all clear. And then he goes, grabs a pine nut and stops feeding. So remember when I told you in the original video footage that there was a mountain chickadee next to the black-capped chickadees in its own bush, totally separate from them? These were the vocalizations of the mountain chickadee. So you can see the alarm call. It had its own alarm call. And then it has its own version of the chickadee call, but it's a much raspier D. It's a he. I call it the Canadian smoker of the chickadee family. There's a chickadee on the mountain chickadee on the right and a black-capped on the left, and it's a great example of dialects in bird languages, right? So they're related species, but sound slightly different, like a Texan and a Montanan, but similar forms in both phrases or phraseology. And there's great studies showing that because they occupy different territories and regions, there's slight versions and variations in the way they vocalize. And the question is, are some of those meaningful? Do they convey different meanings? I'll play back that mountain chickadee's call in a little bit so you can see what it sounds like. So now, chickadees also make another vocalization, that chickadee dee 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 dee, in threatening circumstances. And this is a chickadee 2 months prior to the goshawk, when a northern shrike came in the area, flew into the bushes, and just, it was chaos because it could get into the bushes. The birds all dispensed, went crazy everywhere. I didn't get the recording before the shrike came in. I got it just after. And this is right after the shrike left. This chickadee came back in, occupied this bush, and this was the chickadee calls it was making. So it's probably really hard for you to hear, but there was a chickadee probably another 30 feet away and then another 30 feet after that. And they were talking, to one another, basically. They could hear one another at a range, and they were all going crazy like this. Eric Green and others have done some great studies that show the more D's in a chickadee call that you have, the bigger the threat is. They kind of correlate it to the size of the threat, and in many cases, like a pygmy owl is a much bigger threat to a chickadee because they can get into places and fly into places because they're so small that a bald eagle couldn't get to, or more realistically, a great horned owl. And so they'll have more D notes the smaller the threat, or what I think it is really the bigger the threat, the larger the threat, the more dangerous the threat. And that's what I noticed with this shrike, is just longer sequences of D notes, like 8 and 10 in a row, really pointing out that there's a shrike around. Now, we don't totally know what they're telling one another, if they're telling one another anything, but it gives you another example of these sounds and symbols that they're using in threatening situations. And some great research that's showing there's variations in meaning depending upon how they vocalize those sounds. So now we get really interesting. Remember I talked about the mobbing event about 100 yards from the house? So I go for a walk out where the cottonwoods are, and all of a sudden I start hearing this chatter. And what the chatter was a bunch of chickadees, at least 10 chickadees in this juniper tree, and some nuthatches. And Eric Green and others, again, have done some great research on nuthatch vocalizations when they're trying to indicate that there's a threat, similar to the chickadee mobbing calls. Chickadee dee 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 dee. Well, nuthatches have a particular vocalization as well. And there were a bunch of chickadees and a bunch of nuthatches together. Well, 2 nuthatches, 10 chickadees roughly. And then you can see up here on this one cottonwood, there's one Townsend solitaire, and there was a brown creeper, all kind of huddled in this area, and there was an obvious threat nearby. I heard the threat take off, but I didn't get a view of it. My guess is it was an owl, but I don't totally know. But I want you to listen to the nuthatch alarm call here in this video. So you hear that. That's the nuthatch, and this is the spectrogram symbol of it. And this study over here shows the same spectrogram frequency range. You can also hear the chickadees in there. Chickadee dee 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 dee. So one more time on the nuthatches. So they're all mixed together. So what do? I go back to the bird feeder. I put my speaker out. This time I'm going to play that sequence of events back on that speaker when the nuthatch flies in, and see what happens. soon as it starts, the nuthatch freezes. Now you're asking, well, what if it was any sound? I played all sorts of sounds on this speaker. I played robins, I played my dog barking, I played me, I played chickadees making their chickadee vocalization when my dog walks outside, because they'll usually do a chickadee with a 4D note just to kind of say, oh, I know Shiloh's coming outside. I played, pretty much any bird vocalization I could off that speaker to see if I could get that nuthatch to stop. And the only times I could get it to behave like it's doing here, this freeze move, was when I played the chickadee alarm call, or when I played this series of nuthatch alarm calls. And then eventually figures out nothing's wrong and moves on his way. Then I finally was lucky enough to be out in the cottonwoods, and I caught this chickadee in the same position, and you'll be able to hear this nuthatch in the same frozen position, and you'll hear a bunch of chickadee calls in the background. But I'm not replicating anything. This is live, real time, in a natural context. And I don't know what was going on. I don't know what the chickadees were squawking about. But this nuthatch was obviously in some sort of possible threatened state. It could have been me. The chickadees could have been, squawking at me. But this particular nuthatch will actually feed from my hand. So this nuthatch really doesn't care about me and actually looks at me as a food source. But this will give you a feel for what a nuthatch does when it freezes in a wild context. So you can hear about 5 or 6 chickadees in the background doing their calls. And then this nuthatch basically in a heightened sense of alert, and then eventually it goes back to feeding. So that was it. That was the event. It was just a cool event. And now I just want to give you a few thoughts as a linguist. There's this huge debate going on right now, and has been going on for a while, about whether animals have language or communication skills. And you might have seen a documentary called Project Nim, where this chimpanzee humans tried to teach it sign language, right? And the original person named it after Noam Chomsky, who believes that only humans have language. And others, think that animals can definitely learn language and have language. So over here on the right, you see Coco and Miss Peterson. And, Coco, I think learned over 2,000 words supposedly, and could use them in linguistic context. But there's still a raging debate as to whether or not that's actual language. So you have the people on the right, the people on the left arguing yes and no, animals don't have language. But the reality is this debate goes way back in time, even to the Greeks, and probably across all cultures, where humans lived in much closer context with animals, and they were always trying to compare, what do animals know? What are their linguistic skills compared to humans? Do they have thought and whatnot? So I think it's a little arrogant to say that this is a modern debate. It actually goes way back in time. And I think there's something to the fact that it goes way back in time, including to the Greeks, who are looking at it much closer to pre-civilization or pre-agriculture times, in paleo times, when they still remember hunter-gathering and they still did a lot of hunter-gathering activities. So it's something to keep in mind. I mean, I could talk forever about these two philosophers who were debating. One argued that animals did have language and the other, didn't. And there's a lot of thoughtful conversation about it. And you can learn a lot by reading about it. But I think this bifurcation of do they or don't they is kind of silly. One thing I'd challenge you is if you're interested in this topic, do animals have language? Like sit down and ask yourself, what is language? What is communication? What is thought? What is signal or information? And these are tough topics, right? There are massive volumes of books written on them. So I think we get too up in the sky on some of these debates and not actually down in the weeds of looking at actual animals in context doing the things that they do. And if you do that a lot, I think it's hard to argue that they don't have communication and at some form of language. What that is, I think we still need to work out. Here are some basic descriptions of these different concepts. And if you read them or have time to come back and pause this and look at them, you'll see that there's a lot to these words. There's a lot of complexity when we say something like, what is language? So I would be careful about using those words and spend more of your time just observing animals in context and looking at behavior. Now I'm using that term context. And I want to give you an example because everybody talks about context, but not very many people actually specify what they mean by the word context. So when I used to teach linguistics in summer class down in California, of course, the humanities, we'd get stuck in the older rooms without air conditioning. So we'd be sitting in this hot summer room in California, and I would say, I'd interrupt my lecture and I'd say, it's hot in here. Now, what do you think that phrase means? It's hot in here. Well, if I said it outside of that context, it just might mean it's hot in here. But if I said it to the students, they'd kind of look at me initially, and then I might start talking again about lecture, and then I would say it's hot in here again. And they'd kind of look at me and like trying to figure out what does he mean by that. And then I might look at someone sitting right next to one of the windows and I'd say, man, it's hot in here. And invariably I could often get one of the students to reach over and open the window without saying open the window. So what the phrase it's hot in here means depends upon its context. And of course, we all understand that. There's plenty of examples of language use where you have to understand the context. The question is, what do we mean by context? What is context? Before I get to that, there's a great example of a recent study where zebra finches, males will use the same phrase, kind of like it's hot in here, right? They'll use the same phrase. You look at it in a spectrogram, it looks like the same series of signals or syllables or words, whatever you want to use. And sometimes they'll do it where there's a female around, and sometimes they'll do it by themselves. And if you look at it, it's like, and you listen to it, it's like the same exact sentence. But females prefer the recordings where they give this phrase around other females. And some researchers used some machine learning to really tease apart these sentences, and you could find subtle changes through the computer algorithms. Even though you couldn't hear them, you couldn't even see them in the spectrum, subtle changes that one of two things. The females are picking up on those subtle changes, or it's simply the context that it's given in that creates some sort of emphasis that we're not hearing, and the females can hear it. In the same way, I'm probably changing the way I vocalize it's hot in here through emphasis on certain words or syllables or whatnot that the students could pick up on than if I just did a bland it's hot in here as if I'm describing that it's hot in here. So we're seeing this in animal studies that the same phrases mean different things in different contexts, and there will be subtle changes in the way we say it that indicates the meaning and the response we're going to get to something that's listening. So I'm going to leave you with a framework on what is context that linguists often use. instead of just using this word context, when you think of context and you go outside to watch the birds in your backyard, or watch your pet, or watch the animals in nature, use this when you're trying to figure out what is the context of this vocalization I'm hearing, and maybe by thinking it through this way, I might be able to figure out what they're trying to do, what they're trying to communicate. So the first at the bottom is context of culture. And you can break context of culture down in multiple ways, but the three simplest is just the larger society that a group decides to belong to. And often that is a language group. It's a shared language across the culture. And then that culture will have various practices, beliefs, systems that they follow. But you can go below that, and let's just take, America, and you can realize that there's dialects. You can go to the deep south and someone from Britain may not be able to understand a southern accent compared to a generic English accent from the East Coast, or a Montanan accent that sounds a little more like a Canadian. So you have these dialects where there's slightly variance off of the standard language, right? We're getting more specific. So also think about your animal communication in that sense. You might be looking at a species like chickadees, but then realize that, yeah, there are subspecies or differences in species, like mountain chickadees and black-capped chickadees. But even within black-capped chickadees, there are social groups, right? So just like when you're a teenager, your parents might not understand your teenage language, but your peers do. There might be groups within chickadees that have slight different vocalizations that they're using in social context. And then you go down to the individual level, and even individuals have their own history, their own experience, their own events, and they'll have slight differences and nuances in the way they communicate. And often that's an identifier of them versus others. And identification, using words to identify yourself and others, is very common in human languages. If you take graphs or Zipf-laws of most commonly used words to least commonly, you often see this logarithm or power law graph where the most common words are used a lot of times in a language and the least common are hardly used at all, right? And it drops off pretty rapidly. And basically think of it as an 80-20 rule. 80% of the words you're hearing are used by 20% of the overall vocabulary. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of commonality and then there's going to be a lot of variation down at the long tail of the words. So even though we might say there are 100,000 words in English, usually an average speaker might only know 30 to 40,000, an indigenous speaker. But it only takes 10,000 to be fluent in another language, and it actually only takes 1,000 out of 100,000 to actually be able to function in, here in immigrant Montana, if you were learning the language new. So remember, there are a lot fewer words that get a lot done in any communication system, and I think it's true of animals as well. So remember that when you're thinking of the context of culture, and that individuals will have their own peculiarity, but focus in on maybe some things that are similar across a group. The next context is the context of situation, and that's really when we mean like what is actually happening during the actual vocal event. And those you can break down into things like ideational or ideas, like the what, when, and where that's happening. In time and space, where is this happening, right? Living creatures live in this time and space, and their senses are in that time and space. So what, where, and when are important to the communicative event. There's also this interpersonal aspect, the who and the why. These individuals that are interacting because it's a life and death situation. And so the who leads to the why often, and the why back to the who. So there's these interpersonal relationships that impact what is the meanings could be of the symbols you're hearing, the vocalizations you're hearing. And then there's this third that not a lot of people know about. Linguists will talk about it often, and we call it the textual context of situation. And what we mean by this is that when you use words to clarify the words you're using, so these are often things like, like in English, words like but or and or therefore or because. They're connector words where we're trying to explain, we just told you this and we're going to tell you this, but I'm going to qualify that. So we'll often use these words that we're kind of trying to actually communicate what we mean with words. And that's part of the context of situation, right? It often leads to the why. And so knowing the context of the situation, what's going on around you, will be reflected in these textual words that we hear in human discourse. And I'm really interested to see if we ever figure that out in animal language. And then lastly, built on top of this context of culture, context of situation, is the actual discourse, right? You can talk about language all you want hypothetically or in your head, but the only way to know language is to actually listen to it in real time, right? We can break down language use, we call it, into subparts. So we have the sounds, we call them phonemes, but it's more than sounds, right? It's smells, touch, and sight. It's sensory input. It's these smallest units that we combine together to get meaning. Some animals use sound primarily to communicate, right? I'm sorry, sense to communicate, not sound. Insects is a great category. I think dogs use a lot more smell to communicate than sounds. There's also touch, and then what you see, your sight. You can take sounds, build them together into what we call morphemes, which is a small, meaningful unit. A morpheme is something like, if I take the word walk and I add ing to it, walking or walked, ed, those endings are morphemes. They add meaning to the word walk. Okay, so morphemes have a meaning to it, but on their own, you don't use them. You combine them with something else. And that's often what you're doing with language, is you're combining things to create more and more meaning. So you take sounds, you can make morphemes. You can take morphemes, put them together, make words. You can take words, put them together, make phrases. Then clauses. Clauses are when you often add these textual components. So you'll give a clause and then you'll say because, and then you'll add another clause. And you combine these into sentences and paragraphs. Paragraphs might be some sort of higher order meaningful unit. So if we took the whole Goshawk incident, there might be, paragraphs where the Goshawk's sitting in this tree and the chickadees are, talking about this particular event where it's sitting in this tree. Then it flies over to that tree, and then they might shift, right? That might be a new paragraph, right? But all of those combine together into the final discourse, the entire communicative event that then at some point it has a beginning and it ends, and then you move on to the next part of your life. So when we talk about context, think of all these different layers when you go out and you're observing animals in context. This might be a framework that helps you get at the meaning better when you're hearing the vocalizations. And it's cool. Like, I talked about the context of culture, the differences between mountain chickadees and black-capped chickadees. And that's, coming up with dialects. That raspy chickadee he is how I kind of hear a mountain chickadee. And I showed you that diagram how prairie dogs in different species actually have totally different vocalizations. We don't know yet. I don't think Khan's ever tested whether or not they understand each other's dialect. Maybe he did, but I did hear him say once that he doesn't think they actually understand it. So dialect, you might be able to understand some of the words, but at some point in time you get another different code and you just don't understand anything. So that's part of the culture, right? If you get to a point where you don't understand anything, you're really in a different cultural context, cultural group. The context of situation, we saw that there's this particular alarm call highly focused on a particular situation. There is a threat, and we think it might even have nuances that distinguish between a flying threat, which is far more dangerous. A hawk that's flying is far more dangerous than a hawk that's sitting in a tree. So the situation dictates the word. A cool example that Nathan Pipolo, I think it's pronounced Pipolo, gave in a talk once that I heard is red-winged blackbirds. They'll make this kind of certain same repetitive call. They'll, like, I have some ponds, right, and there's like 15 red-winged blackbird males that'll set up territories in there, and they'll all be spread out, and they'll hone in on one particular contact call, and like one's a tink call, one's a ping call, and they'll keep repeating that. So let's say tink, 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 and you'll just hear them doing that, and there's this cacophony of tinks going on. If they switch the call to another one, it can be an indicator that there's a threat. But what's important is it's not like they have a word for threat. It's they actually just switch from whatever the default contact call is to a new contact call. And that's the pay attention. And there's ways human languages do that. We call it theme and rime, where you're communicating in a default way, and then you change that to indicate some change in the context of situation. And then back to discourse, like with chickadees, these are 4 what we call, some people call syllables, A, B, C, and D of a chickadee. The chickadee, D, D, D. Those are the 4 symbols. Whether they're syllables, whether they're words, whether they're phonemes, honestly, we don't know. They could be sentences for all we know. But we see them use those where they start and stop and there's a pause. But they'll combine these. What's unique about chickadees, they'll put them together in a sequence, and they have a fairly strict word order, just like English does. So, we all talk about Yoda, instead of rest in peace, rest. Greek is like that as well. You can change the word order around, but because of the way the vocalizations work, you can understand what the subject is and the object is in that sentence. Where it's much harder to do that in English, which is why it's confusing to listen to Yoda sometimes. Chickadees have more strict word order like English does. But I want to leave you with this. At the end of the day, it's not just the syllables or the words, it's the entire discourse. This is only 30 seconds of one of those chickadee discourses with the goshawk around. And you can hear all the noise going on, but until you break that down and start looking at, hey, one of those birds was only doing this call, even though he could do the other calls, he or she could do the other calls. This was the only call it was doing. And then this bird was doing the alarm call. This bird was doing the chickadee call. So this discourse, if you break it down into the true layers of context, you start getting a sense for the whole communicative event and not just the song, right? We focus way too much on the song because it's beautiful. There's so much more beauty going on when you look at the whole discourse and then start breaking it down. So that's it. I'll leave you with that. And I'll close with this particular quote. This is a quote from a person named Babrius, who was putting together a compendium of Aesop's fables. So if you think of someone who really talked about animals communicating and talking and being intelligent or whatnot, Aesop's fables is a great one. But this particular introduction to his compendium on Aesop's fables is, I think, one to ponder and just think about with animals. If we go back in time and we think that Aesop was a 6th century BC slave who became, known around, the world supposedly as being wise and famous, and eventually won his freedom because people thought he was so wise and smart. And we realized that this society, 6th century BC, was much closer to the hunter-gatherer world. They weren't there they knew they weren't in that time, but they remember it really well. And here's how, that was described by them. 'Twas a race of just humans who lived first on the earth, the race that people call golden. After them there came, they say, a different generation, the one of the silver. And we, this is Babrius talking on behalf of Aesop, we are the third in the descent among these, and ours is the generation of iron. Now in the golden age, not only people, and that's referring to the beginning, looking back in time, not only people, but all the other living creatures had the power of words and were familiar with such words as we ourselves now use in speaking to each other. Gatherings were held by these creatures in the midst of the forest. Even the pine tree talked and the leaves of the laurel. The fish swimming about in the sea chatted with the friendly sailor, and quite intelligibly too, the sparrows conversed with the farmer. Everything grew from the earth, which made no demands on men, and good fellowship prevailed between gods and mortals. Think about it. I'm not saying we need to anthropomorphize animals and think that humans and animals talked, but I do think there's wisdom knowing that that former era knew that the era before them was much closer to what was going on in nature than we are, and was much more attuned to nature than we are. So with that, ahoa, and feel free to email me. I'm really interested in your thoughts, corrections, your own examples of animal communication, and how we can keep pushing forward in this area. I want to give a big call out to the Earth Species Project, earthspecies.org, and all the great work they're doing to use machine learning and AI to make it easier to hopefully translate different animal species languages and give them a voice so that we can find coexistence strategies for all of us. Thank you.